Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Hey, Ariel.
Hey, Peter.
I got to tell you that this is the moment that I feel like my younger principal self is just like screaming on the inside because, I'm talking to Michael Fullan, and it's just so, for me, it's so weird because I've known him for I've known his work for a lot longer, but I've known him for 10 years. And like people will hear at the beginning, I needed to thank him. I just needed him to know how much I've appreciated the fact that he has just always been so giving with his time to me over the past 10 years. So I hope I didn't come off too badly at the beginning.
No, your fanboy thing wasn't coming across too overwhelming. So don't worry about that.
He's just one of my heroes. So the fact that I'm in a position that I can talk to him so freely is just really nice. And he is always when I talk to him, I feel like I have to bring more than my A game because he is just the brilliance that comes out of him. And I don't mean that in some superficial way. He's just, what people will hear, he has so many deep thoughts and he's written so many fantastic books that talking to him is just like a master class. And that's how the podcast felt.
That's right. Yeah. It's amazing how many great ideas and like perfect little phrases and snippets are coming out of this podcast. I mean, he packed so many great concepts into these 30 minutes. It's really crazy. And I've been working with Michael for, almost 8 years, and I've just never met anyone else who can talk about something new every single time you talk to him. And he knows it so well and he explains it so well. It's really incredible. I love that he's got this learner's mindset where he's always curious about something new. He's always exploring something different and doing research and listening to the people who he talks with. And he takes what they tell him very seriously and he uses that to improve his own work. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, you can tell that he listens when he's working with people. And you're right, that curiosity that he approaches things with, I think that's what separates him from so many other people. Because he's curious and he's a man that's in a position to be able to say, like, I'm Michael Fullan. I can, what I say goes. And he's like, no, that's not the way it is. So I know that you're a big fan of quotations. So before we get the podcast going, what was one that you thought he had that you were like, I'm going to take that away because I know my favorite quotation that I want to talk about.
Oh my gosh. Well, he talks about Systemness, which is its own, another example of a great Michael Fullanism. And he says, it's this mindset and understanding of what our place is in the system that we are operating in. And he says the goal is to exploit upward, liberate downward, and lateralize everywhere. And I'm not even going to try to explain what that means. I'll just let people listen to it because Michael says it so much better. But I do want to add real quick before we get started, just for those of you listening who don't know who Michael is, and I hope that you do, but just in case, Michael Fullan is a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, and he's the founder of New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. And he is one of Corwin's longest time authors, certainly kind of a godfather in the education leadership space, and one of the just most brilliant thinkers, as you can tell from just our effusive praise for him in this conversation.
Yeah, I just, before we go, my favorite quotation was always, and I said this to him in the podcast, but we were in New Zealand together. It was actually the first time I met John Hattie. So John brought me down to New Zealand and Michael was there. And Michael said, just because you're stuck with their policies doesn't mean you need to be stuck with their mindset. And forever, that was just, such a great quotation. But I hope everybody enjoys as much as we clearly have. I hope everybody enjoys the podcast with Michael Fullan.
That's right. Let's get started.
Hi, Michael Fullan. Welcome to Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you, Peter. Good to be with you again.
So I just want to start off because I want to say this publicly. I want to thank you because you have been a great mentor of mine for the past 10 years. Obviously, I knew your work and books well before that, but from when I started writing the Finding Common Ground blog for Education Week, you have shown me nothing but kindness with your time and everything over the years. And I really, really want to just say how much I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I remember you from the beginning. You were a hungry mentee, I'm going to say. So easy to work with that way because you were gobbling it up and forming your own ideas. So it's really great to see your development over this decade.
Well, thank you. And it's always great to be able to have time to talk with you. And I feel like we could talk about so many different topics, but one of the things that I found out that you've just recently published is a new research paper on drivers. Could you talk a little bit about why you decided to do that?
Sure. I did write a policy paper in 2011 called The Wrong Drivers for whole system reform. And I wrote it because the policies that were getting stronger, remember, it's 2011. So in 2000, we got No Child Left Behind. And then the standards movement came more and more. The punitive accountability got worse and worse. So at that point, 10 years into it, in 2011, I said, well, these drivers are actually not only not getting the results, they're causing us to go backwards. So the 4 wrong drivers, one was punitive accountability. Second was individualism, which you'll like because now most of us are working towards collective efficacy. So individualism was a wrong driver because it didn't add up. And the third one was technology. It was getting, people were buying it like crazy, but not knowing what to do with it. And the fourth one was ad hoc policies or fragmentation. And then I had some discussion about the right drivers, which were capacity building, pedagogy, things we now have built up. But I said in that paper that really it was on the wrong track and we should start switching over and developing the others, but it wasn't so fully on the right drivers. So this one, 10 years later, I was talking with the superintendent in California about 4 or 5 months ago. And I said, what do you think of the policies in California that are emerging? Because we ourselves are working at all 3 levels in California as a state that could potentially get major transformation. They've got a long way to go, but there's a lot of good things going. So I said, what do you think of the emerging policies? And she said, well, actually, they're not very meaningful to most of my colleagues, superintendents. We need another driver's paper, she said, casually, I think. And as soon as I got off the phone, I thought, well, that's a damn good idea. It's 10 years. That's a kind of anniversary date. And I want to have something to say. I don't know what it is. So I jumped into it. I got I work sometimes with CSE, which is the Center for Strategic Education in Melbourne, Australia, because kind of an umbrella to talk about policy. So I said, what do you think? Because they published the last one and they also thought it was fabulous. So I didn't know how it was going to turn out. I just know I wanted to say something. And then I ended up writing pretty substantial reframing, and we can talk about some of the details, but I consider it to be really comprehensive, but meant for debate rather than for here's the solution.
I like that. I like that very much. One of the things that I noticed from COVID, and I want to get deeper into the policy paper, but one of the things that I noticed from COVID was the technology piece. And I realized it was very hard. I'm not judging anybody, in March of last year, so a year ago, I remember getting on Facebook and there were 2 teaching pandemic pages and there were over 206,000 members who joined, which is just amazing to happen, in that short of time. But one of the things I noticed is that a lot of people were saying, what technology tool do you use? What technology tool do you use? And it really seemed like the the thing was to grab the technology first and then think about the learning after. So did you see some of that when you were developing the paper, and did that help inspire maybe where you were going with the 10-year anniversary one?
It did, because I saw the absolute mania about technology because of the needs of remote learning and Zoom and so forth. And that mania, there's two ways of putting it. One was it was going to generate some good ideas within it. There was no question about that, and it was needed. But I also thought that technology didn't need any help. It's kind of got a natural place in the market because it's tangible. You see it every day. People are close to it. Big money is investing in it. So it doesn't need any help at the level of broad exposure. It's going to be massively intrusive, I guess is the way I want to put it. So I wanted to then say, yeah, it's here. It is going to be probably resituated in a way that can be more helpful potentially, but it could also mean much more harm. So you'll know in the driver's paper, the new one, there are 4 pairs of drivers, and this pair we're talking about is social intelligence vis-a-vis artificial intelligence. So social and artificial intelligence. And I posed partly provocatively was that we've overestimated machines and we've underestimated people. And I think all the stuff we're doing on collective efficacy and social intelligence now is really the tip of the iceberg of where we haven't leveraged social intelligence or collective efficacy, use a different word. We haven't leveraged it enough. And that's where the upside is. The upside, technology will come along, but it will never carry the day without people.
Why do you think we still have, this is something that I always think about. Why do we still have these situations where we know that the research around collective efficacy, whether we're talking about leaders or teachers, can be very powerful, and yet it's such a struggle within schools? So, I mean, that's got to have something to do with the social intelligence. Is it that we don't trust people? Is it that we enable instead of empower? What is the reason behind this?
I think part of it is that the concept is attractive, but it's not precise. Mm-hmm. So with technology, it may not be effective or may do this or that, but at least, you know what you have, you can hold it, you can turn it on and all of that stuff. So it's more accessible. Collective efficacy is not accessible. It's a concept that requires a lot of thinking as to what really is the good meaning of it. And then secondly, requires a lot of action I'll say it this way, against the traditional culture of schooling, which has not been organized as people talk about when they talk about the grammar of schooling. 200 years ago, it has never been organized for the culture of collective efficacy. It's not really set up for that. So that part, it means it's an uphill battle against all the other things. So hard to grasp, even harder to put into practice, not the favorable conditions that we need. But on the other hand, the good news is when you start to see it and when you work with it, you see its tremendous power. But I think it's going to require good work to put it in place. And that's all the more reason. In fact, it takes me back to the book on nuance, where I said all leaders seem to be doing somewhat the similar same things, but the nuance people, they go deep into the culture. They put in the extra effort. They learn with others. So there's a qualitative difference for leadership and others to implement this work carefully, and that requires additional commitment, additional realization that you really have to work at it. It's satisfying, I think, once you get that far, but there's a lot of inertia at the beginning.
Yeah, one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is the whole idea of accountability, which is why I loved the paper on wrong drivers. I remember the first time I read that, actually. Is there a concern right now, because what we've talked about, and what you and I have talked about in the past, on a panel actually with Pedro and Patricia and Andy, is the fact that this whole idea of COVID loss, because you keep hearing the COVID learning loss piece. Is there a concern that this accountability, the wrong driver of accountability is going to be maximized here? Or do you think that we've learned something over the past year and maybe accountability won't be an issue?
No, I don't think we've learned that enough to to combat it. I think what a lot of people have become more doubtful about external accountability. There's no question about that. And that provides the context for the next 2 or 3 years. I'm going to say the post-pandemic will be more productive in dealing with that problem. But the immediate pandemic it really is people's, again, knee-jerk reaction is more, well, there's been a tremendous loss of learning. We better fill it up again. And it's natural, and I think it's probably even well motivated. But loss of learning is exactly the wrong motivator for most students. You just this is the silver lining right now. When loss of learning is discussed, as it is increasingly today, tomorrow, the next day, students are the first ones to say, "That's not how I want to think about it." And so we're counting on, because we do mobilize students in our model, we're counting on students to be partners to sort out that loss of learning is a mindset that takes us down a negative track that's demotivational for the majority of students.
Yeah, I feel like so I started a web show for Ed Week last year called A Seat at the Table, and we've been talking a lot about race on the show. And I feel like one of the study threads that has gone through all of this, including the conversation that we had with Pedro and Andy and Patricia in January for Corwin, was this idea of deficit mindset. And I feel like every time I hear about these things, like learning loss, and especially when we're talking about race, there's a deficit mindset that's going on there. And so I like the way you're framing it about that's not the way that students are going to look at it. One of the pieces that you talked about in the wrong drivers versus the right drivers is fragmented versus systemic. And I mean, we all know Coherence was a brilliant book that you put out. Such a brilliant title and content within the book. How is this post-pandemic period going to work more along that systemic line and that coherence line?
We are predicting and part of stimulating a very different and deep approach to coherence, if we use that word again, in the next period, which I'm going to say starts actively late 2021. We're still dealing with the last vestiges of the pandemic, so you can't really take off under those conditions. But there's a lot of reasons, I think, major reasons that would cause one to think that there's going to be a brand new effort that we have never seen before. And I think those reasons are the two clusters that go together. One is the catastrophic climate deterioration, which is causing fear among people, young people, I think, and they almost can look in the mirror and see their future around the corner, around the deterioration of the planet. And then secondly, there's also the deterioration of the social fabric. If you take assessments of social trust, Putnam's latest book on Upswing, they have data that show in the 1960s, social trust was around 50-60%, and now it's around 30%. It's plummeted like crazy. So you have more mental ill health, anxiety. You have more social inequality, incredibly. You have bad social trust. So all of these things are really established in a way that people are, palpably worried, like almost tangibly so. And so that's the backdrop. And then the fact that the last 5 years, I'm going to say even more so than 10 years, but the last 5, the good ideas have been emerging, the work on collective efficacy and other things we've been doing on system change. So the good ideas have been emerging since 2015. And therefore, the bad ideas telling us that we're heading for destruction, and the emergence of the good ones that have proven themselves on a small scale have led people like us to say, this is the time to pounce on it and leverage the good and trounce the bad. And so I think this is going to be a decade of good, and it's going to gain momentum, and it's going to start midway through 2021.
Yeah, I always felt like when I was a school principal that when we were going through the difficult times, that's where I found my best leadership. And I think that's the important piece, is that during the toughest times is sort of when we can find our deepest and greatest leadership skills among not only the people that are in a leadership position, but those people that like come up to the top. So
if I could just say, reinforce that, because it's very specific. The pandemic has contributed in a positive way to it. What has become more apparent, I think, to school leaders, because they've seen it and they've been part of it, is parents are more partners now, potentially. Students are better partners, teachers are. So the democratization of leadership, with still the school leader coordinating a lot of that, orchestrating it, participating as a lead learner, whatever phrase we want to use, that democratization of leadership means the increased power of the organization to transform.
Yeah. So when what we know about drivers and what you've said in the past is that they impact student learning 100%. I just put a quotation of yours in something I'm writing. So, drivers impact teachers and impact students 100%. So how does this, for lack of a better way of saying it, anniversary edition, how do you start to look at all of those kind of things? Like what deeper pieces are in there? Because I know you've talked about things like well-being and those kind of issues as well. And you were just talking about the whole catastrophic climate and, social fabric. So I know it's more of a paper to inspire debate as opposed to these are the right answers, but how are you covering those kind of issues within that? What are you looking at there?
Well, there are 4 positive drivers in the paper, 4 pairs, but 4 on the positive side. And each of them have been moving a little bit. And I'm going to help them come into more prominence through this paper. So those 4 are the shift, that, as I call it, from academic obsession, which only serves at best 20% of the people. And even those 20% that do well under the academic schemes, they're called by one of the books the wounded winners, because there's all kinds of penalties and anxiety and stuff, and they don't end up being pretty healthy for life anyways under complexity. So the shift is from academic obsession to well-being, which includes learning, and well-being not as a really positive force. In fact, the only way I can imagine humankind surviving the next 30 years is through a massive increase in individual and collective well-being. There's no other way. So that's the primary driver. And then academic learning can contribute. And then the second driver is social intelligence, which I'm putting my money on the quality of people working together under the new knowledge of collective efficacy. And the reason I don't have to put my money on technology is the market is putting its money on technology. So it's going to grow anyways. I don't have to help it. And it's got the downside, but it'll grow enough that if you want to leverage it, you can leverage it. And then, so I think that's a big one. And then the third one was, and this is where it is, what gets us into policy, was money investment in equity, and compared to austerity is what the latest economists, there are at least 4 books have been written by women economists in the last 5 years. They're fabulous analysis of the last 40 years, which, as I won't go into because it takes too long, but it's proof positive there that the gap between the rich and the poor have increased. We know dramatically. The numbers are there in your face every year since 1980. So it's bad, and worse. And then now the new realization, and we see it in the current administration's investment. The idea is to invest in things that build up the equality and the capacity therein of the population. And if you do that, society will generate more wealth, basically, more net wealth and more equal wealth. It doesn't have to be entirely equal, but more equal than this huge gap. So I think that third one is a big one, a big part of the equation, because that money can be wasted if the first 2 are not the right agenda. The money can go in and can get wasted. So I think those 3 are great together. And then the last one I have is systemness, which is somewhat of an odd term, but I've shifted from systemic to systemness, because systemness is something, it's like coherence. It's in your mind. You can think about the system that way. And I've heard people just actually yesterday, a superintendent sent me a note. They said, I've been grappling with systemic for 10 years. And once you explain systemness, I saw that that's what we are trying to get. We're trying to get people to think about they are in fact part of a system. So I think there's a way in which these things are coming together. And because there's a democratization of leadership, and because these four drivers are, I guess I'll call them democracy-laden drivers, there's a connection here between what people think they want, and when it's articulated, they realize that is what they have a propensity for, and that these are the combination of the powerful right drivers with the democratization. By that, I mean just many more people involved in making it happen.
Yeah, I have to say, you always amaze me and get my brain going, because when you were talking earlier about the equity thing, about the equity piece, I remember I did an interview with Andre Perry, who wrote a really great book on Know Your Price and about redlining for Black communities and investment into them. And Richard Rothstein just had a really powerful book come out on the same topic. But when you were talking about the systemness, do you think, and one of the research articles I was reading recently was from Dimick, who said that, like, from a system standpoint, I think where building leaders get, I don't want to say confused, I guess for lack of a better word, that's what I'm going to use. Like, building leaders always feel like they're in the middle. But what they forget sometimes is that they're actually a part of a system. So they might lead what they see as a system, but at least in the United States with school districts, they're also a part of the system. And that's where we get some of the, tension, right? So we've got building leaders who want to run their building, but they sometimes forget that they're part of the greater system, which is a school district. So that whole idea of systemness, I think, is a really good one to have, because it's quite a huge topic in the way that we can't just think about the system we run. We have to think about the system we're a part of.
Yeah. Yeah, I have this around the new work writings on systemness, this take that says exploit upward, liberate downward, and lateralize everywhere. So exploit upward is that don't think of those above you as somebody you should try to avoid their policies or literally implement them. Think of them as a resource that you're part of the system. What can you take from those resources, content or money, that will allow you to do better locally? But make sure when you're doing better locally that you've created a collaborative culture within your school, that you're liberated, in other words, teachers and students, and that you are linked into the community, and that you're in networks of lateral schools. Get all that going and see yourself as a system coordinator that way. And I think a lot of the principals who now want something more to happen are drawn to that analysis. They can see really how it could work. And it's exciting for the school leadership now, because instead of figuring out, am I a manager? Am I do I inspire people? They're much more in like, this is the system. I've got to make it work for my community. There's a big opportunity now. I can get networks, but I can also have in my community with parents something. So to me, it's exciting to be a school principal if you've got a decent district surrounding you, and then bigger policies that are in this direction we're talking about.
Yeah, some of the best 8 years of my life, actually. It reminds me, what you just said reminds me of, as you know, my favorite Michael Fullan quotation. When we were together in New Zealand years ago, you said, just because you're stuck with their policies doesn't mean you need to be stuck with their mindset.
Yeah. I forgot about that one. I should use it again.
Giving you credit every time, but I've used that quotation so many times because to me, it's just such a brilliant quotation. And I think it speaks to what you were just saying.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we go, we're gonna have to wrap it up soon, which is a disappointment for me because I could talk to you for a long time. But I know that one of the things you've been working on lately, and one of the phrases you've been using lately, is one called big spirit. What does that speak to? This whole idea of big spirit.
Well, we've one of my colleagues, superintendents that I've worked with off and on for 10 years is Mark Edwards, who is superintendent at Mooresville and did a great job of integrating technology and culture. So he and I teamed up again a few months ago. We're doing a book with Corwin on this, but he said he's noticed, because he has a lot of connections that are superintendents around the US. And he said there's about 8 of them. I can name them just like this. They're diverse, and they have this fantastic kind of more ambitious set of that he called big spirit. In other words, it's not just, we used to say moral purpose. Moral purpose is I'm going to say not an exciting word. Big spirit has that sense of something. So these superintendents, the way I would describe it, because we're now studying them, looking at them, is that they're implementing things or leading things that are democratic, doing a lot of things we've been talking about in this podcast. They're doing that, and they have kind of transcended the complexity of hopelessness, which is really almost there, that some of us can succumb to. And they're above hopelessness, causing what I now call learned hopefulness. My phrase is experienced helplessness versus learned hopefulness. So what they represented, we saw was because I talked to each of them, is that they're going, despite the conditions being horrendous. This is like, there's never been a worse time to be a superintendent than the last 12 months. Yeah. And yet they're not discouraged. They're, if anything, said we've got to go better. So these people are going to land on their feet, and they're going to do a lot more over the next year or two. So that the big spirit is that ability to transcend the reality of negativism and see that the only response we can have to negativism is to make it better. And that's what they're driven by.
I have to admit that's probably a great way to end this podcast, Michael, because when we talk about transcend the negativity, Lord knows there's been a lot of negativity around, and you're absolutely right. This is a time that we need to really be able to focus on the positive and transformation and those kind of things. And we're realists. We are where we are, and now we need to be able to move forward. So transcending that would be great. Michael Fullan, thank you so much for being a part of Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast and just taking time always to talk with me.
Thank you, Peter. Looks like we'll have lots to talk about in the next 12, 24 months.
Sounds good.
Okay, take care.
All right, Ariel. So I think I have to admit, when I am old and gray or grayer, I will look back on my life, and one of the things that I will honestly look at with such appreciation is the fact that I got to know Michael Fullan, like over the time that I was working in leadership, and how he's just somebody to learn from every single time I have a conversation. And I think that podcast was a perfect example of what conversations with Michael Fullan are like when you're not on a podcast with him too.
Yeah, well, great job leading the conversation, and good questions from you. So it was a great conversation. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
All right. Well, Ariel, tell people where they can find this podcast and how they can help support us.
Yeah. If you're enjoying the content so far, please be sure to leave us a review on Apple and Google and Spotify. Actually, I don't know if you can leave reviews on Spotify, but leave a review wherever you can. You can check out the website for show notes, and that's corwin.com/leaderscoachingleaders. And if you're listening to this, you can also watch each show on YouTube, on Corwin's YouTube channel, or if you're watching the show, you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. So I hope you join us there.
Yes, and thank you for those of you that have been listening to the podcast. But thank you, Ariel, for joining me once again for Leaders Coaching Leaders.
That's right. See you next time.
All right, you too.